One of the most often seen quotes on cross-country team shirts from when I was in cross-country, probably before and well after I'll be dead, is "My sport is your sport's punishment," which is really just our way of saying our sport's tougher than yours. It's just how it is. But I'm also a mathematician at heart, so today on this episode of Runner's High, I want to figure out, is cross-country harder than football? If you've not spent any time with me on this channel, then you probably don't yet know. This is a show about running, so let me give my bias up front. I've been a runner for almost 20 years, so I'm going to skew probably towards the running side, but I'm going to try my best not to, because as mentioned, I'm also a mathematician, if my undergrad degree is to be believed. So I want to kind of look at the numbers and figure out, is there any way to compare these two different sports? They're really two very different things, so it's kind of hard to compare, but I've got some numbers and we're going to dive in and see which one's harder and why. Let's get the first kind of noticeable differences out of the way. Although cross country is technically a team sport, it is still by and large an individual effort. Football, obviously, and we're talking about American football here. Sorry to my worldwide friends, we refer to football as soccer. We're talking American football. So football is clearly a team sport, and really even a three-team sport if we're thinking about offense, defense, and special teams. So those are part of what makes it so difficult to compare the two. But we can actually look at one component that should be relatively even between them and see which is harder, and that is calorie count. How many calories are we burning for a given activity? Clearly we're probably talking about high schoolers here when we're talking about football, or really cross country in this case. So if we have a 150-pound athlete and they're playing full contact football for a half hour, they're going to burn roughly 350 calories. Now, if we take that same athlete, 150 pounds, they're running, we'll say 7-minute miles, just to say they've got a little bit of speed on them, but they're not a speed demon by any stretch of the imagination. There are plenty of high school runners doing that. 7-minute miles for a half hour is 390 calories. Now, we have to keep in mind that obviously there are football players that are much larger than 150 pounds. There's also runners that are much faster than 7-minute miles. So when we're trying to compare apples to apples, we try to keep things as even as possible. So my 7-minute mile thing is a little bit arbitrary, but I'm trying to pick a kind of moderate intensity. So in this case, 350 versus 390, 1 point goes to the runners in terms of being harder, having to spend more calories when you're doing your sport. But what about training? Which sport has a harder training regimen? One of the things I noticed, whether it's high school or college, is that often we had 1.5 to 2 hour practices max. Now, the football team, especially early season, are going to have longer practices than that, and in that early season, often we're doing 2-a-days. Granted that the football players are not in motion the entire time, but even for a 2-hour workout for runners, we're not in motion the entire time either. You're going to be doing intervals on the track, that kind of thing. So we already know that football players are spending more time training for their sport. That's going to be more difficult, but not just because of the time spent, it's because of the energy to stay mentally focused. And the consequences of losing focus are greater in football than in running. Now, I talk a lot about how important it is to keep your mind sharp to be the best runner you can be. But let's think about this for just 1 second. If I'm out, say, trying to run a 5K or in training, whatever it is, I momentarily lose focus, I can refocus, get back on my pace, and make up a little bit of time in my interval. But if you're training in football, you're doing scrimmage, whatever it is, you lose your focus, you're going to miss that tackle, you miss that catch, whatever it is, you could cause the other team to have the ability to get a gap, score points. The effects of losing focus are going to be more devastating or more consequential, have bigger effects in football than it is in running. So I'm going to have to give more points to football in this case in terms of training than running because of that mental aspect. Now, if that wasn't enough to convince you that football players get a hell of a time when they're training, one thing that always stood out to me, regardless of the amount of time or energy that was spent during training, is that there's one big difference between us, and that's equipment. Footballers, or football players, I guess footballers are really soccer players, football players have to wear pads. And I saw them out in ridiculous heat, still wearing pads, sweating their butts off. Whereas we could wear t-shirts or tank tops, or sometimes, if the coach allowed, depending on the culture, no shirts at all. So we get the benefit of staying cooler, not having to wear the extra gear. So points definitely to the football players, hats off to them. Training, I would say, probably much more difficult for football players than it is for runners. So our last component here, which is tougher in competition. This is where kind of the rubber meets the road, right? When we get down to it, who has it harder on competition day? So if you're running, keep in mind, cross country is a team sport. So if you don't know, you score 5 runners based on their place. So a perfect score in cross country is 15. People who, if your team placed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it adds up to 15. That is the only possible perfect score in a cross country race. Your 6th and 7th runners are your tiebreakers, and so you can field a team of 7. Now, a football team, obviously many more players, 11 players for each phase of the game, plus you've got players on the sidelines for different plays, you can switch them out. So I would say, because both there are multiple ways to score in football, and because you can substitute players out, give them a break, whereas in a race there are no breaks. It is start to finish. You got to go hard the whole time. There is an edge here for runners in competition. Not only that, but when we're talking about the field of competition, football players generally know what they're going to have, right? You've got a 100-yard field, you've got 10 yards in both end zone. The field goals are set up in the same position. They'll vary slightly, I think, depending on field setup, but are pretty much the same across the board. You kind of know what you're working with. Whereas cross country, it's just going to be what it's going to be when you show up. It could be a flat, fast course. It could be a hilly course. There could be a lot of turns. There could be no turns. You could have to start uphill, start downhill, have a really sharp contraction of runners from the beginning. There's a lot of unknowns when it comes to cross country and getting to a course, which is why you have to go out to the course, warm up, check it out, try to kind of figure out where you're going to pace yourself throughout the course, and just deal with it on race day. There's a lot of unknowns. Again, because of these unknowns, I'm weighing more heavily towards runners having the tougher job here, not knowing exactly what to expect. Now, lest you think I've forgotten, injury rate is a very important part of competition, how often we're injured. It's something I talk about on this channel a lot. If you don't know that, hit that subscribe button, stick around with me. I've got videos on dealing with injuries as a runner. Injury rate, takes us out of competition. It makes things tough mentally, both because we're hurt, which sucks, but also because there's kind of a process you have to go through to rehab, to get back in things, all that kind of stuff. Now, I'm going to use numbers from the NCAA because the NCAA tracks injury rate across all sports. And they do this by tracking injury rate per amount of exposures. So if I want to explain what an exposure is, it's basically anytime somebody is involved in a practice or a competition. That means if I show up to practice 5 days a week and also compete on Saturday, that's the 6th day, I count for 6 exposures even though I'm one person. So if we look at the NCAA's data, and we look at men's cross country in particular, women's cross country actually has a higher incidence rate, but because we want to compare men to men, and there are currently no women's football programs, we're going to use the men's data. So the NCAA says that men's cross country has an incident rate of 4.7 injuries per 1,000 exposures. So that is, going to be our kind of baseline here, right? But when we look at the football players, a little bit as expected, it's almost twice as high at 9.2 injuries per 1,000 exposures. On top of that, if we take into account the severity of the injury that you can get from football, football is definitely going to be pulling out here hard in competition, and the ability to be tough, the need to be tough in competition. You know, those kind of injuries you can get in football can be potentially life-altering in some severe cases, whereas those things are going to be much, much more rare in cross country. It's going to be like sprained ankles, stress fractures on the kind of bad end, those kind of things. So really, when I get down to it, I have to kind of almost say we're really at a tie or a standstill between the two sports because they're so different. Yeah, in cross country, you've got to go hard from start to finish. There are no breaks, there's no timeouts, there's no stopping. And in football, you do have breaks, you do have those timeouts, but you've got to stay focused. You cannot slip up at all. There's no time for that. The consequences are higher, both in terms of injury and in terms of keeping your team together to reach your goal to win, right? So I'm going to go with the kind of almost cop-out here and say we're relatively at a tie for competition, which puts us at a tie overall. I know that's a little unsatisfying, but again, these sports are so different. It's really hard to compare them. We've used the numbers the best that we can. Let me know, what am I missing? Can you make an argument for cross country, or can you make an argument for football? Leave them down in the comments below. Let me know what I missed in the video. What do you want to share? Make a case for your sport. I'll see you next time on the next episode of Runner's High.